podcast from Drew and Mike is, I think it's really cool, and that is what I wanted to say.
Two and a mic. Having Aidan back is just fun. It speaks for itself in many ways as we simply bounce off one another with our ideas and thoughts. And it's a real pleasure to look at such serious historical characters in our unique method. Madison is a president, number 4, who people should definitely take a look at. He was intelligent, very intelligent. He had difficulties emerging above the towering personalities of the day, but he managed it and he thrived, mainly through the support and inspiration of his wife, Dolly. Dolly masterfully carried and massaged political relationships in a way that would make today's marketing and relationship management gurus scratch their heads. Anyway, I shan't delay a moment longer. Aidan is back, and we jump into the histories of Western democracies with gusto and colour and the kind of industrial language you may have come to expect from such an occasion. Great to have you back, Aidan. Enjoy. Aidan, I've got you back again, and I think a lot of people are going to be happy because you can't imagine how many people have been talking to me about Aidan, you know?
Man, that's wild. Well, I'm back. It's good to be back. Been a little bit busy with my social life and like getting back to work and kind of like post-COVID life figuring out. But it's good to be back. I feel a lot more stable and like ready to jump back into some of this stuff. But it's good to be back. Yeah.
Great. It's great to have you back. And I should also point out that in the intervening period, and people don't realize that you do a lot of background production work on the Road to Tarvalon, which is a far more condensed podcast with a lot more, because there's also a YouTube channel and there's a lot of different kinds of organizational things that that they do, that your mum does, and so on. I don't have, of course, but yeah, you've been really busy on the podcast stuff, so people shouldn't think that you've been out of the game at all. But yeah,
still deep in podcast land. I edit that podcast pretty heavily, so like all the music and like everything that goes on with that, and like kind of condensing those podcasts down to be a little bit more listenable and like a little bit more of a easier flow and whatnot is kind of what I do on that podcast. But like it's good to kind of be back and being able to record a podcast. I haven't been able to do that in a while, but like other than that, I'm like, oh gosh, it's so good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Oh mate, it's good to have you back, because also I think there are sort of history professors around the world crying out for Aidan style historical analysis. You know, and I still love the fact that you refer to some of the founding fathers as dudes. I mean, I think that kind of stuff is priceless. But yeah, let's not mug around so much anymore. So today's, I suppose, presidential victim is James Madison.
Yeah, what a guy. Man, I was like kind of surprised. I didn't realize that he had 2 terms. That was a little bit surprising. I thought he might have just been like a 1-term president, but nope. Yeah, interesting guy. Not a lot of like big things in my opinion that I was like, yeah, this is like super noteworthy, but like lots of throughout his entire political lifetime, just like backstabbing friends, like the whole time was kind of the big thing that I was just like, I don't like you. This whole time you just like kind of backstabbed everybody just to kind of get the benefit for yourself and like promote yourself. Like his allies throughout, gosh, like Alexander Hamilton was one of his allies that he was like, yep, never mind, screw you, like you've got these different views than I do. Like they butted heads through most of like their political lifetime, but like to be making such enemies out of like your friends through your entire political life is just like, damn, brother, like, oof, I don't know why you do that. That's a bad call.
Yeah, I mean, he's quite well regarded in some of the work that he did before he became president,
Mm,
and that's kind of what you allude to with regards to his relationship with Alexander Hamilton, and other sort of political luminaries of the period.
mm,
So he was president from 1809 to 1817, and in my sort of generalized introductory notes, I've termed him founding father, father of the U.S. Constitution, and slayer of Brits. Um, is that too much? Do you think? I don't know. I mean, how do you see it?
no, I think that's pretty fair. Like, I mean, the War of 1812 and like that that being like something during his presidency and that being such a pivotal like that war went horrible. There were very few victories that ever happened. There were like the peace treaty was eventually sent in, but like the amount of victories that America had lost and the amount of like our White House was burnt down. Like that's the only time in American history where something like that's ever happened. So like his presidency is kind of marked with these moments of like these embargoes that didn't work out, these trade acts that didn't work out, and kind of like being like, you know what, I'm gonna go to like we're gonna go to war. And beforehand, this entire time, like the Jeff or not the Jeffersonian, but the like more Federalist side of the party had kind of disbanded the army and the navy to a heavy degree, so that way this war wouldn't go well. Um, so like throughout this time, like he's making these moves, but he's made so many enemies in his own party and throughout the parties outside of his that most people are pretty much against him throughout his entire presidency, which I thought was like an interesting idea. Like you have the presidency, you should be a little bit more like you should have more people on your side. Like Jefferson had quite a few people on his side. He was a very popular president compared to somebody like Madison. But like Madison is just like enemies at the wazoo. It was wild.
Yeah, but I guess maybe the reason why he was able to do what he did was that he was quite a respected sort of a political activist in the build up. I mean,
Hmm.
he came up with what is known as the Federalist Papers with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. So that this was like a collection of 85 articles promoting the ratification of the U.S. Constitution.
Hmm.
Um, and apparently this was done because Hamilton had noticed these anti-federalist papers that were being published in New York
Yeah.
under somebody called Cato, and he was responding to them under his pen name Publius. And in discussions with Madison and John Jay, they eventually produced these series of articles,
Yeah.
which apparently later on became, or at least led to that what became the Constitution. So he was very instrumental in pushing
Mm.
for the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and so therefore had a
Yeah.
lot of respect in lieu as a result, didn't he?
Yeah, and absolutely. Like his earlier career is like marked with things like the Bill of Rights. Like being such a heavy advocate for something like the Bill of Rights was something that really played in his favor. He brought up the Virginia Plan during the time that, like, while America still had the Articles of Confederation, like our original Constitution, he had proposed the Virginia Plan, which was very heavily based on like the legislature branch, the judicial branch. His plan never ended up being like the final plan, but it was very heavily like a lot of the plans that we talk about now that made a huge impact. His plan was one of them. The Virginia plan is a huge one in it. Like he's got a lot of impact in his like studies his writing, he was really like succinct in being able to write his ideas out. He wasn't like as fiery as somebody like Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton, but he was very like well spoken, well written. He was well educated. He went to Princeton when he was young. Like he knows what he's talking about. He knows what he's doing, and especially in his early career, you see a lot of his like advocating for like religious freedoms was one of the biggest things that he did right when he got out of Princeton was like he went back to his hometown and he advocated for like the religious freedoms of um, I think it was the Baptist group that was in his town, which was primarily Anglo-Saxon at the time, and he advocated for their religious freedoms very heavily. And like, that's one of the reasons why we have the Bill of Rights is his advocacy for those religious freedoms, really pushing those ideas. He had a big impact on that, in my opinion.
Mm. And it's also interesting. So he is the second of four Democratic Republican presidents, the fourth of which, John Quincy Adams, in my notes, is half Democratic Republican and half National Republican. So therefore, there is this sort of separation, as it were, of political ideals that starts to develop later on. And perhaps that which forms the basis of the parties which we see today, the Republicans and the Democrats, because there's a sort of European ideals or political ideologies such that nowadays we look at left and right. That's something which has come to us from the French Revolution. But as you talk about Hamilton there, I look at my notes and I see that he, after being or serving in the Continental Congress until 1983, when he returns to Virginia to serve in the state legislature, he was very disappointed in how the state government worked. So he, as you say, he's very much a Republican. So he wanted to see stronger government. He wanted to see less excessive democracy. And this is where there is a clear point of conflict with some of the people of his time. So Jefferson was more wanting to be a sort of majority ruled by the people, and so on. Hamilton was an elitist, and Madison was that strong government. These were the arguments, I suppose, of the day.
Yeah, and these arguments really like the arguments between Madison and like his opposing parties, like during this time, Washington had very heavily been like, we don't want political parties. Political parties are going to be like the downfall of America. It's like one of his famous quotes. And the attacking between these two parties really started to take place during these times between like Jefferson's presidency and the lead up to Madison's presidency. We see a lot of this attacking between these two parties, and it very much is reminiscent of like what we see today in terms of the same kind of attacking of the political parties. Like they're different because they're on the other side, we're the right side kind of thing, and like these heated debates that kind of just don't end up going anywhere, like, and these attacks that are just like simply based out of like, you're not me, like we're different, screw you kind of thing. And that really started to pick up during Jefferson's presidency, and at the beginning of Madison's presidency, you start to see a lot of these attacks happening in the press. Madison kind of biting back a little bit, like the Federalist Papers are kind of one of those things where like anonymously he's kind of biting back against some of these ideas. And I think that that's kind of like his earlier career is a little bit more fun than his like presidential career. Like his presidential career is kind of like he gets into presidency and he's just kind of like he's just met with a lot of struggle. Like the whole time he has just met with struggle.
And as you say, we should also mention, because I'm pretty sure this is going to figure highly in his rating, but as his predecessor, he was born into wealth. He lived on a slave labor farm, which we refer to normally as a plantation. And he, as you say, was very intelligent, but he was a person of sort of lesser, shall we say, physical stature, and so therefore he focused very much on his ability, his mental abilities, his
Yeah.
intelligence, to be able to carry him through where other people were always, oh, look at this great man, he's
Yeah.
such a prowess, as it were.
Yeah.
And Madison had to do it in a more difficult way, didn't he?
Yeah. I mean, standing at, if I'm not mistaken, he was 5'4", which is very short for, especially, I mean, for a man, and even in that time period, that's still pretty short. But like compared to somebody like George Washington, who's standing around the same time as this guy, like George Washington was breaking like 6 feet, if I'm not mistaken. So like, got these towering men, and then there's like little James Madison, he's a little tiny guy, and I mean his intelligence is really what brings him to the table. Is like him being able to stand with these greats, even though he doesn't compare to their size whatsoever, he's still able to make these massive waves by putting in his ideas and like not really being afraid to speak those ideas either. Was one of his big things, especially earlier on, is just kind of like, I've got these ideas, I'm saying it, I'm just gonna fucking say it, I guess. Like, and he did, like, and it worked for in his favor often, like especially in the beginning, kind of like getting these allies in the Continental Congress by bringing up these ideas like Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. These are all like people that he became close with in these early years, and they really were very influential in terms of like in the long run how he was able to establish himself in presidency, like being so close with like people like Thomas Jefferson, like he was his Secretary of State during his presidency. So it makes sense that he would be able to kind of get in there.
Mm. And also ridiculously hardworking, which appears to have been a trait among the earlier presidents. As in, I know nowadays how many of them work. I mean, a few days
Yeah,
here and there of golf. You don't really need to work too hard, you as president nowadays. But
it's a hard job. I don't know
mm.
what you're talking about. They're out there in them fields, dude. I don't know.
Yeah. But in the old days, definitely. Prodigious either in writing articles, letters, meetings, getting involved, doing things. What's interesting as well is obviously in the early presidents, the ones who we've already mentioned, they've all in some way created some kind of precedent. They've introduced a certain kind of culture within the presidency in the formulation of this government. And what appears to be the case is, once again, Madison inherited a lot of wealth from his father, but he also married a slave-owning family who, despite being a Quaker, kept hold of some of her slaves, even though her father emancipated his own slaves after the Revolution, from what I've read. However, Dolly had a huge impact on Madison and his success as president. So as we've kind of observed, his career or his persona was a bit more special before becoming president.
Yeah,
But after he became president, he really had to rely on the charm, intelligence, and wit and beauty of Dolly. And what's really interesting is, as you say, he created lots of enemies. So he wasn't really the kind of person who could, get everybody to come join me, let's do this, and so on. He
yeah,
was very argumentative. But his wife created a lot of social events at the White House, inviting friends and enemies,
yeah,
and turned the White House into this bit of a place for knees up, basically.
yeah. Nice little, like, especially considering like a president who is so like with enemies at the wazoo, like having a wife who kind of compliments him in this way that is like able to be the outgoing member, be able to bring these people together. Like it finally having somebody like that for Madison, like a lot of people, when Madison finally met Dolly, were like, a lot of his allies and his friends were very happy for him because they were like, finally he has found somebody who can kind of compliment him in this way, like, and luckily she did stay with him like his entire, like, up until he died. And like that sort of relationship is really nice to see, because I feel like it's something you don't see too often, in terms of that beautiful complementary, like, somebody who can kind of be quiet and somebody who's a little bit more outgoing. I enjoy that, like, kind of perspective, and I like seeing that for the presidency. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Is there, because I've made lots of notes with regards to some of the problems which Madison had to deal with um, at home. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, because we've traditionally looked very much at a kind of this sort of international arena, the development obviously of the nation,
Yeah.
but also relationships with France, war with Britain,
Mhm.
and so on. But I've also done quite a bit of research here into how he dealt with First Nations people and tribes, and
Yeah.
I've got a huge potentially monologue which I could read, but I'm kind of first of all I want to see what direction your research took, because we completely do things independently.
Yeah.
There's no, none of it is we don't organize this stuff between us. You do what you do and I do what I do. Where
Yeah.
did you lead? What was your interesting point?
Just kind of like getting into, like, kind of his first major quote unquote victories were victories that took place during the, like, the War of 1812, mostly with tribes, like, that he sent armies out to go fight them. And like, during this time the British were kind of like encouraging the tribes to fight against the Americans, who were like kind of pushing against them, which makes sense. But at the same time, uh the just mass slaughter is like, this is kind of the beginning of what we see in, like, the Trail of Tears, is like this beginning of a push in this mass slaughter of people who have already been here for so long. um, but I'd love to hear what your monologue is. You've got me intrigued.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I mean, for me, this it's a bit of a disaster because I'm looking at it from the perspective of obviously what happened thereafter to First Nations. But you've got the British colonists who had managed to attract the support of the Iroquois, the Catawba, the Cherokee tribes. And then the French colonists, supported by Wabanaki Confederacy member tribes, Abenaki and Micmac, and I know I'm pronouncing these terribly, but then there's also the Algonquin, Lenape, Ojibwa, Ottawa, Shawnee, and Wyandot or Huron tribes. So, yeah, obviously these European powers, they have sent whatever people across that they have,
Yeah.
but they are completely taking advantage of First Nations tribes and saying, okay, you guys, you join with us, we're going to give you what you want, but first you've got to kill those guys over there. And well, essentially, you could even call them distant cousins. But yeah, they didn't care because
Yeah.
what the hell?
Yeah. I mean, gotta protect your land somehow, and like, gotta have allies. So in this kind of way, like, it's such an interesting idea, like this, like, here, we'll help us help you kind of thing. And then, like, if you can help us, the idea that, yeah, everything will, like, you guys can totally have your land kind of thing. We won't ever encroach on it. We won't take it over kind of thing. Like, that even if somehow, if like there was an alternate timeline where the British did win and like they still took over, like, I imagine that no matter what, there would still be this drive out of the original, like, the First Nations people, like, I think that is just this colonizer mindset of like, we must do this, we have this new place, and now let's take our stuff and let's spread it out, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, we're talking here about the background to the war, which then developed through the decades and so on. But as in the initial tactics that we saw were just continuously repeated and repeated and repeated. And what I thereafter eventually noted down was that essentially the creation of the USA, the irony I've written, is that the deepest form of horrific irony is that the early creation of the United States, they killed a nation that need not have been killed to create a nation that would never be comfortable with its legacy. That's the way that I kind of see the US at the moment, because I still believe there is in many areas extreme discomfort with what is domestic US history, and this is borne out by DeSantis' laws, where he's talking about controlling divisive content in schools, that no race should consider itself responsible for events of history and so on, and that they shouldn't be in any way blamed for that history and so on. So, I mean, they are essentially trying to clean the slate of a slate that cannot be cleaned.
Yeah. It's impossible to cover it up, is what it feels like. Is just like kind of like, don't talk about it. We can't talk about it. And if we don't talk about it, then it didn't happen. And there's far too many people who want to continue to talk about it, and far too many people who still frankly remember a lot of things like this, and still remember experiencing things like such like heavy racial discrimination, like acting as though it's something that doesn't happen anymore. Like, no, these are still things that happen today. These are still things that we struggle with today. We still need to find a way to talk about it in a more comfortable manner, but like the idea that we just can't talk about it is such a it's such a bass-ackwards way of putting things, like just in terms of like, why? Like, we should just be talking about it so that way we can have a better understanding of it, so that way we can better understand all sides of these points that we have greatly fucked up a lot of shit in America, the First Nations, slaves, like we fucked ourselves up, and this idea of being able to wipe this slate clean and have this beautiful legacy of like, our founders were wonderful people, they were all great. Like, no, that is not true. We need to look at this in like today's point of view. What kind of things were they doing that makes the things that they put into place so like not in line with this current time, you know? Like the idea that people putting things in place during the late 1700s still being applicable today. Like, yes, there are some things that are still applicable, but a lot of it is still just like outdated. It's outdated. Like, there's a reason why our Constitution is a living document. It's made to be amended. It's made to change with the times. Like, it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. I'm not sure that there are many nations that have managed to successfully sort of view their history and in some ways come to terms with what they have done, how they have formed themselves, at the cost to whom, and so on. I'm not sure there are many countries that can look back and say we've done what we needed to do. But definitely the right way about it is not to introduce laws which mean we should no longer talk about them. And that to me just simply suggests weakness rather than strength. But maybe that's what's to be expected, unfortunately, of the modern Republican Party.
True. Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But jumping back to then after the War 1812. So after the French sort of lost their influence in North America, this was a huge disaster for the native tribes who they had supported or had been supported by France as well, and vice versa. But thereafter, there was zero support or help from any international power. The native, the First Nations people, Native Americans, were simply left to their own devices, and so, the government of Madison took advantage of that,
Yep.
basically. And there, I mean, in this we have to mention Tecumseh. And historians traditionally viewed the Battle of Tippecanoe as the sort of final devastating blow to Tecumseh's Confederacy. So he had grouped together a group of tribes to try to fight for that which they felt, was rightly theirs, clearly. But this Battle of Tippecanoe was that which, sort of took care of any chance that he may have had of creating a sort of final homeland or place where they could consider their own. Yeah. I mean, how I mean, did you get to any of the because I really looked quite deeply into this, because for me it was important to reflect upon the perspectives of the First Nations people, and who they had got together with, and it's a bit tragic for me to read back a history and think, because it's so easy now to say, man, why didn't you do it this way? Why did you have to do it that way? And as I was reading, I was really hurting, with these individuals. They're 200 years dead, and yet I'm still thinking, man, guys, I wish. Do you know what I mean?
Like, the whole time you're just like, why would we do it this way? Like, why is this a humane route to take? Why is this a mindset that we feel as though is appropriate for, like, moving people? Because, like, it's not even moving people, it's just fucking slaughter. Like, making our armies move out there and just kind of like being like, yo, welcome to our land. Actually, like, this is a very just it's heartbreaking, and it is, like, infuriating in a lot of ways, just because it's like, this is such a horrific route to take unnecessarily. Like, I feel like there could have been so many better routes to take, like you said, where it's just like, you look at it now and you're just like, why would you do that? But, like, in terms of the research that I had for the First Nations, like, there was not a lot in terms of, like, what I was finding for, like, a few documentaries I watched. Like, they felt like they kind of just brushed it over. Like, they were just like, and some of these major victories with the First Nations, like, and that was kind of it. And after the ending of the War of 1812, just kind of this change in, like, Madison's persona. Like, he kind of went from being this very dour man to being a lot more uplifted. He'd finally done something, and just kind of like being picked up in this way. But, like, a lot of the documentaries that I had watched just were not mentioning a lot of the, like, deeper aspects of, like, the First Nations battles, and, like, the aspects at which James Madison was, like, involved with them, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I strongly recommend that people, if they are indeed interested in some of the stories of the First Nations people, and how the fact that they are so underrepresented nowadays in American political society, they should probably take a look back at these years and try to identify exactly how severe some of the tactics were, because there were also propaganda coming out, even perhaps later on, how the different interpretations were towards Tecumseh and one of his colleagues, as it were, in battle, Tenskwatawa. And people have said, well, yeah, there wasn't really animosity between the two, but other people have said, no, yeah, there was. And this is, perhaps a question of propaganda, in effect,
Yeah,
dividing and conquering. These principles have existed for thousands of years.
yeah.
Unfortunately, I think the First Nations people were perhaps not prepared for that kind of strategy.
I think that like it makes sense that they wouldn't be like having these are two very different nations at very different levels, like America during this time is very like boom, we are on the move, we are ready to go. We've got people, we've got like we're not great on money at the moment. Like America is struggling with debt, but like this push and like having something like the printing press is a huge benefit compared to somebody like the First Nations who everything that they did was all spoken word of mouth. Like all their stories, all their information was all spread word of mouth. So having this sort of like these are two completely separate groups that are completely different that take on these things completely differently. So it makes sense that they wouldn't be able to combat something like that so easily. Like if you're on the battlefield and then you get moved to the next spot back, like the people behind are only now hearing about it. Like, and so they don't have the same time to prepare. They don't have the same ability to like kind of congregate and come together and be able to fight against this horde of Americans, really.
Yeah, yeah, and also the fact that these sort of successive American presidents have been educated along the lines of European history, along the lines of sort of really battle-hardened studies for, from ancient Rome or even Greece and Sparta all the way up through, to the French Revolution. So
Yeah,
the kind of tactics that they were able to employ built up over centuries and centuries.
yeah,
In many cases, you can say perhaps the First Nations, disregarding technology, is just purely the kind of strategies that the Americans were able to introduce. I mean, I imagine that there were certain intelligent tactical warriors among the First Nations, and in fact, Tecumseh is considered one.
mm,
I made a note here. Major General Isaac Brock wrote about him to have been, noises everywhere here, but to have been, he said of him, a more sagacious or a more gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist.
mm,
So there are qualities that were to be observed from a strategic perspective of First Nations people. However, were they skilled in deception?
yeah,
Was that at all, or had that really been a part of their strategies in the wars between the tribes? Were tribal wars conducted under perhaps more honorable circumstances?
yeah,
Because essentially there were simply different tribes of the same kind of race, perhaps.
yeah,
Whereas with European history, you're looking at completely different nations, different cultures, and they didn't care what tactics they employed as long as they won.
yeah.
Um, so do
And
you
I
see it?
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, like I mean, it feels like it's to be expected from like America, like especially like fighting the British right out the gate. Like during that time, they were fighting in much more like organized patterns, so like kind of rank and file marching. And America was like, yeah, no, we can't do that. Like we don't stand a chance against something like that. So like America started like the American troops were like fighting from the trees and they were fighting from the bushes and they were taking like very like what we would call like guerrilla warfare tactics like today. Um, and so like it makes sense that America would kind of take all these like deceptive routes to kind of be like, yeah, no, we are just going to do whatever the fuck we want to do in order to get the thing that we got to get. And like, it's very much like we're going to be seeing this manifest destiny taking place very soon of like this American ideal that we do have this land. Like this is our land. It's our destiny to go grab it and go take it and conquer it and like make it ours. And we'll be seeing that in the next few presidents when we get there, like that this is a huge drive that we're going to start seeing the American people take on the same kind of like push out west that the army is currently doing to kind of like get the native people out. Is such like a horrific push. It really is. It's just devastating.
When Madison became president, it was kind of a part of his policy to introduce the natives into what was considered, he said, a civilized state. So to convince them to become more farmers, to develop European-style agriculture, essentially to assimilate, for the Native Americans to assimilate values of British and US civilizations. The question is, how much was that forced upon these people? Were their interests taken into consideration? Apparently, Madison didn't really believe that the native tribes could be fully assimilated into Euro-American culture, because he said they were simply unwilling to transition from the hunter or even the herdsman state to agriculture. So therefore, clearly he had different strategies in line for how to achieve them.
And I mean, it plays a part in the future as well of how America deals with the First Nations peoples, is like putting them in these like schools and being like, here's all these like Americanized values, kind of stripping away any kind of like identity that they may have associated with their tribes. Like I believe that a lot of that stuff starts happening in the early 1900s. Reforming schools, I think, is what they may have been called. But kind of this drive of like getting, quote unquote, getting the savage out of them. Like that was the drive that a lot of the like politicians had. That's what a lot of them saw, and it's this like, it's merely a lack of understanding of a culture, a lack of understanding of a people, and in turn a lack of willingness to understand. And that lack of willingness is really what drives this just like brutality, is this push. Like, we don't care to understand because your values are not the same as ours, so fuck you. Like, get out of our land. And that's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, and in fact, as you say, I mean, he was very much biased against them. He considered them to be savages. And apparently it was his Secretary of War, William Crawford, who advocated the encouragement of intermarriage between Native Americans and the European Americans as a means of assimilating them. Which then led to some kind of public outrage, and so therefore turned the newcomer Euro-Americans even more against the indigenous peoples and even more hostile. And that, basically takes us up more or less to the end of his presidency. He retires back to Montpellier, which, as we've already observed, is a plantation. Even though it was in some way, it was suffering a decline because of price declines of tobacco and also his stepson's mismanagement. But anyway, that's a different matter. I'm happy for some amount of pain and displeasure to have fallen upon this individual.
Yeah, sure. You had to sell some of your slaves and some of your land to pay back some of your debts. Fuck you, dude. Like, that's kind of just like, why? Like, going through all these like historical figures that we put on these pedestals, it's just like you uncover so much about them, and all of it is just like, maybe I understand why Ron DeSantis doesn't want us to talk about some of this stuff, because it's not good. But at the same time, we need to talk about this shit, man. Like, the fact that you and I are talking about this, and the fact that there are people who listen, like, I'm sure that there's a lot of information to be spread that a lot of us don't know, and especially here in America, like, we aren't taught a lot of this stuff in such depth and in such detail, where we get to learn about the misdeeds of these founders, as well as their fortunes and the great things that they've brought us. Like, we are mostly taught these great things. We're not really told about their downfalls and the things that they've done as human beings that make them human beings. Like, I hate going through and just being like, oh yeah, no, these people are not on pedestals at all. Like, they can't be. Like, we're all human beings, but the idea of Americans just really, like, all of our founders are on pedestals and they're heavenly halos around them, the shining light glowing down, like there's chimes playing in the background. Like, no, man, every time that we do this, it's just this like deep dive in how wrong that is.
Yeah, and the terms founding fathers keeps getting bandied about almost as though, just for that one unique act, these people should be heralded as with some kind of angelic influence upon their reputation. But if that's the case for many people today, it was not the case for James Madison himself in his final years, when he basically resorted to trying to change his letters and documents so that he would be seen in a slightly different light to that which was the case. I mean, apparently he was, I don't know, he was almost like addicted to forging even other people's writing, just so that he could, produce some other kind of reflection or proof of who he really was.
Wow. What
yeah,
I mean,
you read that and you think to yourself, man, how desperate do you have to be that you would even change your own letters, your own writings, because you realize, oh, 1 minute, I look like a prick here and I should perhaps change that. That's who he was. And it's not really known very much.
Yeah, I'm like, I did not know that. That is, ooh. Yeah, I don't like that at all. That puts my score for him a little, like that's at least 10 points down or something like
that. He must be close to minus at this point. But so he died in 1836 at the age of 85. So he lived a long life for the days. So you mention it, so we might as well come to it. Let us remind ourselves of the scores of his predecessors. So George Washington got 37, John Adams, the Federalist, 24, Mr. Jefferson, 12. Aidan, I'm putting you under pressure here. What are you going to put for Mr. Madison?
Gosh, this is a hard one. I think that he's also in the 20s. Say maybe like 21. He's not good. He's not. I feel like he's not as bad as Jefferson. So I think he's a little bit above him, but enough of his actions is like the wars, his fighting of the First Nations peoples, his disagreements with all these other members, like his presidency doesn't really amount to much. So I'd stick at like that 21. I think 21 feels good.
Okay, yeah. I mean, as always, I mean, I'm happy to go with that. And I mean, I think we've already commented in previous episodes when talking about the US presidents that a lot of the first bunch are going to be heavily tainted by their association and willingness to continue in owning slaves. Madison is no different. So we will, in fact, see how that plays out later on. But as we kind of talked before we got into the podcast, that we're going to address a few prime ministers. And recently, obviously, King Charles was crowned king, and in that time frame, the last couple of months, a few media establishments were talking about whether or not or how much Great Britain and perhaps the royal family in the years gone by had played roles in certain events, perhaps, for example, the slave trade and so on, and whether or not there would be some kind of reflection, and whether or not there would be some kind of funding for educational programs to talk about this. But then things kind of went a bit quiet. But as we know, because we've already looked at a couple of the early prime ministers, and we are well aware of the kings who were engaged and actually set up some of these trader routes and companies. There's a lot more to get into, isn't there?
Oh yeah. I'm excited just to hop across the pond again. It's always an interesting time.
So we're going to be fair, and we're going to butcher the legacies of some of these British prime ministers, but not by fabricating what they did, rather by talking about the truth as well as we can find it. And we'll see where that leads us.
Yeah, I'm excited. Time to hop across the pond. Time to get us caught up with those PMs to our presidents. And gosh, man, time to find out some horrific history, man.
Yeah. Aidan, what can I say? I've been looking forward to having our chat again for months. I'm really happy that we've been able to reestablish this particular program. And whenever the next one takes place, I can't wait.
Yeah, me too. I'm stoked. I'm already like, man, I'm going to have to start researching. So I'm excited. Thanks for having me, Zach. I really appreciate it.
Mike. And Mike.